Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special, a story that drifts between history and shadow, where the past lingers like smoke in the lungs. Our video is titled, Boring History for Sleep, Why You Wouldn't Have Survived Mining Coal in a Company Town. For the next little while, we're going to sink gently into that world, one where the hills themselves seem to breathe dust, and life was measured not in years, but in shifts beneath the earth. Before we step into tonight's story, take a second to like this video and subscribe, so these mysteries can reach others in your family too. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see where you're tuning in from, almost like tiny lights glowing on a map across the world. And now, let us begin. The hills were older than the people who walked among them, older than the company towns that would one day cling to their slopes like clusters of weary houses, older even than the first settlers who cut paths through the forests. Beneath the roots of trees and the soft carpet of moss lay a treasure that was not gold, nor silver, nor any gem fit for a crown. It was darker, heavier, and far more consuming. Coal had slept in the belly of the earth for millions of years, pressed into black seams by time itself. When men found it, they found not only fuel, but also the beginnings of their own captivity. Coal, to the surface world, promised warmth and power. It promised fires that burned longer than wood, furnaces that could smelt iron and steel, engines that could move trains across continents, and ships across oceans. Nations grew hungry for it, and cities were built on its smoke. Yet what lay beneath those hills was not simply an answer to human ambition, but a burden. The black dust clung to every hand that touched it, and once it settled on a town, it never truly left. At first, the hills were quiet. They seemed endless, covered in trees, their creeks running clear, their soil rich enough for small farms and homesteads. The people who lived there scratched at the ground, planting corn and beans, raising a few cattle, cutting timber to build their homes. But the deeper hunger of the world reached them soon enough. Word spread that coal lay in thick veins underfoot, waiting to be dug out and hauled away. And where there was coal, there would be work. Where there was work, there would be a town. The towns did not rise naturally, the way villages sometimes did near rivers or crossroads. They were not born of neighbors slowly gathering together, building a church, a mill, a marketplace. No, these towns arrived almost all at once, like camps that hardened into permanence. A company would buy the land, sometimes from farmers eager to sell, other times from families who had little choice but to leave. The trees were cut, the ground cleared, and rows of houses built quickly, cheaply, one after the other, narrow and plain, each with just enough space for a family. The company would own the houses, the store, the roads, the mine itself, and the families who came to live there would find themselves bound not by fences or walls, but by debt and necessity. Still, in the beginning, there was hope. Coal meant wages, and wages meant bread, perhaps even a chance to send money back to distant relatives or to build a future. Immigrants came. Italians, Poles, Irish, Slovaks. Men who had crossed oceans to escape hunger and hardship, only to find new struggles awaiting them beneath the American hills. They arrived in the company towns carrying little more than their names, their languages, and the belief that hard work might buy them a better life. The hills, however, had no mercy to offer. Each morning, the men woke to the tolling of the mine bell, or to the sharp whistle that cut through the fog. The sound carried through the narrow streets, past the church steeple, past the sagging porches of company houses, through the cracked windows where wives and children still slept. It was the sound of descent, the summons to go underground. Above ground, the air might still be cool with dawn, carrying the scent of wet grass, wood smoke, and bread baking in iron stoves. But soon, each man would leave behind the light of day for the dark beneath. The black dust began its work even before the first shovel was swung. It clung to boots, to the seams of trousers, to hair, and to skin. The miners coughed it out in the mornings, spat it into basins, rubbed it from their eyes. Over time, it was not only their clothing that grew dark, but their lungs as well. Breathing coal dust was like swallowing the hills themselves, grain by grain, until the body became another chamber of stone. And yet, in the company towns, coal dust was not just a hazard of the mine, it lived in every corner of life. It blew through streets in gusts, settled on laundry hung to dry, turned white curtains into grey veils. Women scrubbed and swept constantly, their hands raw from soap and water, but no amount of cleaning could rid their homes of the fine black film. Children played in it, drew shapes with their fingers in the dust that gathered on windowsills. Babies, barely old enough to walk, coughed in their cribs as if they too had been underground. The hills themselves seemed to carry the weight of the mines. Where once there had been silence, now there was noise, the pounding of hammers, the creak of timber supports, the rumble of carts loaded with coal, the endless rhythm of picks against stone. At night, when the mines quieted, the houses still groaned with weary men returning home. They sat at rough wooden tables, eating bread, beans, and salt pork, while the coal dust drifted invisibly through the air. Outside, trains stood ready, their iron wheels waiting to carry the black treasure away. The tracks cut through valleys, hugging rivers, threading between hillsides. Day after day, coal cars rolled out of the company towns, carrying with them the wealth of the hills. Yet little of that wealth stayed behind. The miners' wages passed quickly into the company's own store, where prices seemed always higher than in distant towns. A man could spend a week underground, risk his life with every shift, and still find his pockets nearly empty when payday came. In time, the miners began to realize that the black dust was more than a nuisance. It was the sign of a world that fed on them. The company did not simply own the mines, it owned the very rhythm of life. When men woke, where families lived, how food was bought, what debts were owed. To breathe coal dust was to breathe the proof of their bondage. And yet, the hills remained. They rose quiet and unchanging, their forests slowly thinned, their streams clouded with runoff, but still they stood. To the children who grew up in the company towns, the hills were both prison and home. They climbed them, ran along their slopes, looked down upon the rows of houses below, the chimneys puffing smoke into the air. From above, the town seemed small, fragile, a collection of roofs and rails beside the black mouth of the mine. The hills gave little comfort, however, for beneath their surface, the darkness always waited. Generations would pass through the mines, fathers teaching sons, uncles leading nephews. The knowledge of seams and tunnels passed down like inheritance. Men learned to listen to the earth, to feel its tremors, to sense when a roof might fall. But no amount of skill could guarantee survival. The hills claimed lives often, and without warning. A sudden cave-in, a pocket of gas, a spark in the wrong place. Such things could happen in a moment, leaving families without fathers, women widowed, children fatherless. Still, the black dust carried on. It coated the mourning clothes, filled the lungs of grieving families, spread through the town as if nothing had changed. And so life continued, one day after another, in the shadow of the hills. To outsiders, coal seemed like progress, a triumph of industry over wilderness. To those who lived beneath its spell, it was a slow suffocation. The black dust was not just the mark of labor, it was the mark of inevitability, of a life shaped by forces beyond any single family's control. To be born in a company town was to be born into coal, to walk streets that would never be free of it, to live in houses where the walls whispered with it, to breathe it until the end. And so, under the weight of the hills, a story began, not of triumph, but of survival measured in days and breaths. Coal was the beginning and the end, the black dust that crept into every corner of life, binding the people of the company towns as tightly as the seams of rock bound the coal beneath their feet. The hills gave up their silence reluctantly. and in the wake of that silence came the sound of hammers. The coal seams, once hidden in the dark layers of stone, drew men and money to the valleys. But coal alone could not be pulled from the ground without hands, and hands could not work without roofs over their heads, nor roofs be raised without streets to line them. And so the company, eager to turn buried rock into profit, set about building not only mines, but entire towns. They appeared quickly, as if summoned from nothing. Trees fell by the dozen, their trunks dragged aside, their roots left jutting from the earth like broken teeth. On the cleared ground rose neat rows of houses, identical, narrow, and grey. They were not built to last for generations, nor to offer beauty or comfort. They were built for efficiency, each one a box meant to contain a family, with thin walls and a roof that creaked under heavy rain. The company erected them cheaply, but the cost of living in them was not cheap at all. A miner arriving with his family would find little choice in the matter. The company owned the houses, and so the company decided the rent. It owned the store where flour and beans and meat could be purchased, and so the company decided the prices. It owned the mine, where wages were earned, and so the company decided how much a man's labor was worth. The town was not a place of freedom, but of managed existence. To live there was to be bound as tightly as the coal seams themselves, pressed in by walls of debt. The debt began as soon as a man arrived. He might need tools, pick, shovel, lamp, none of which he could afford to buy outright. The company would provide them, of course, but at a cost added to the ledger. Food, too, would be bought on credit until wages came, and those wages were rarely enough to cover the balance. Instead of money in his hand, the miner was often paid in scrip, tokens printed by the company, stamped with its name, accepted only in the company's own store. A man could work long hours, return home with his body aching and lungs heavy, and still find himself unable to escape the chain of debt that grew heavier with each passing month. This was no accident. The company town was designed as carefully as the mine itself, laid out to keep men close, to keep them working, to keep them dependent. Streets were planned with the mine at their center, so that every path seemed to lead back to the shaft's black mouth. Houses clustered in tight rows, their chimneys aligned, their porches nearly touching. There was little space for gardens or small fields. Families could not easily grow their own food, and so relied on the store. The design was not only physical, but financial, ensuring that every need pulled a family deeper into the company's orbit. To walk through such a town was to see order imposed on life. The same sagging porches, the same muddy yards where children played with sticks and stones, the same laundry lines strung with shirts that never looked fully clean, no matter how much scrubbing was done. The dust from the mine drifted into every window, turning curtains grey, coating the dishes stacked on shelves, clinging to the very air the families breathed. The buildings bore the company's mark, though no sign proclaimed it. Ownership did not need to be written on a wall when it was already written in the contracts, the ledgers, the wages, and the scrip. In these towns, even leisure was touched by debt. A man might walk to the company store on a Saturday evening, his children trailing behind, his wife's shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. Inside, the shelves carried goods from distant places, canned peaches, bolts of cloth, tin toys. They looked like luxuries, but they came at inflated prices. The tokens in his pocket, earned by a week of labor, would never stretch far enough. A sack of flour, a slab of salt pork, a bag of beans. These were necessities, and they consumed nearly everything he had. The company kept the books, and in the company's books, the balance rarely favored the worker. It was a quiet form of captivity. No fences surrounded the town. No guards patrolled the streets. Families were free, in theory, to leave. Yet where would they go? Beyond the hills lay miles of wilderness, and the nearest independent town might be too far to walk with children and possessions. Without money, real money, not scrip, a man could not pay for a wagon, could not buy land elsewhere, could not start anew. The debt bound him. and by binding him, it bound his wife, his children, and the generations that might come after. And so the town grew into a world of its own. The church bell rang on Sundays, calling families to kneel together, coal dust still clinging to their clothes. The schoolhouse gathered children on weekdays, where they practiced their letters while the windows let in a thin, grey light. Some children dreamed of leaving, of becoming something other than miners. But more often, the boys would grow tall, their shoulders broadening, their hands calloused, until the mine called them too. The girls, meanwhile, learned to scrub, to cook, to stretch meals thin, and one day they would take their mothers' places in the same narrow houses. The company towns gave the appearance of stability. Streets were orderly, houses filled, wages paid, but beneath the surface, tension lingered. Men spoke in hushed tones about the prices at the store, about the deductions taken from their pay, about the danger underground. They muttered about strikes, about unions forming in other towns, about promises broken by the company's agents. Yet fear held them silent. To speak too loudly was to risk eviction, for the company owned the very roof over their heads. And an evicted family, with no money and nowhere to go, was a family undone. This was the cruel genius of the system. It demanded labor while ensuring obedience. Each miner knew he was replaceable, that another man could be brought in, another family housed, another ledger filled. Immigrants poured in from distant shores, desperate for work, willing to take wages that barely sustained them. The company's reach was long, and its hunger for coal unending. Still, life continued. Women swept porches, mended clothes, and hoped for enough coins or tokens to buy a little sugar for tea. Children played stickball in the streets, their laughter mixing with the coughs that came too early to their small lungs. Men trudged to the mine each dawn, lamps swinging from their belts, their boots sinking into the mud of streets that never seemed to dry. The town pulsed with the rhythm of labor, debt, and survival. To live there was to live in balance on a narrow edge, where a missed shift, an injury, or an accident could tip a family into despair. And the accidents were many. Word spread quickly when the whistle blew at the wrong hour, signaling trouble underground. Women gathered at the mine's entrance, their faces pale, children clinging to their skirts, waiting to see who emerged and who did not. In those moments, the debt seemed more merciless than ever, for a man's death did not erase what he owed. His family still lived in the company's house, still bought food from the company's store, still owed rent and credit. The black dust did not release them. It tightened its grip. The town was not simply built on coal. It was built on the illusion of choice, on the careful weaving of wages and debt, on the quiet acceptance of hardship. It was built so that men dug coal, not only to fuel distant factories and locomotives, but also to feed the very system that kept them trapped. And as the trains carried away the black wealth of the hills, the town remained, its houses weathered, its streets muddy, its families forever balancing between survival and ruin. The company's power was not loud, not overt. It was as steady as the hills, as invisible as the dust in the air. And in its shadow, entire lives passed, lives measured not in freedom, but in ledgers filled with numbers that never seemed to settle to zero. A town, then, was not merely a gathering of houses and streets. It was an edifice of control, as solid and unyielding as the rock from which the coal was pulled. It stood as a reminder that debt, once sown into the soil of daily life, could bind a man as surely as chains. The black dust beneath the hills had been unearthed, but above ground, it reshaped human lives into its own pattern. A town where everything was owned, where everything was owed, and where escape seemed as distant as the horizon beyond the hills. The streets of the town carried the dust of coal, but they also carried footsteps that led inevitably to a single place, the company store. It stood at the center as though it were a church, a courthouse, and a marketplace all at once. Its broad windows displayed what passed for abundance. Sacks of flour stacked high, barrels of dry beans, bolts of cloth folded neatly on wooden shelves. To the eye, it looked like prosperity. To the families who entered, it was a place where hope was measured out in tokens, where hunger was bartered against debt, where empty pockets spoke louder than any prayer. Inside, the air was heavy, with the scent of flour dust, kerosene, and salt pork. Wooden counters stretched the length of the room, and behind them stood clerks with ink-stained hands and watchful eyes. Every purchase was written down in ledgers, columns of numbers that seemed to grow longer by the week, pages that told the hidden story of each family's survival. Men and women carried scrip in their hands, the company's own currency, thin slips of paper, or round brass tokens stamped with the mine's name. They had the look of money, but none of its freedom, for they could not be spent anywhere beyond the reach of the town. A miner might step forward with his week's pay, tokens that clinked softly as he set them on the counter. He would ask for flour, beans, perhaps a bit of lard if he could afford it. The clerk would weigh the goods carefully, place them in a sack, and then mark the purchase against the man's account. If the account tipped too far into debt, the goods would still be given, but the numbers in the ledger would grow. It was an unspoken truth that no miner could ever truly repay what was owed, because the system was designed not for balance, but for hunger. The women of the town learned to stretch every ounce. They boiled bones for soup until nothing was left, cut loaves of bread into thin slices to make them last, sweetened tea with molasses when sugar was too costly. In their kitchens, the shelves were rarely full, yet they made meals out of scraps, teaching their children to be satisfied with less. On Sundays, when families gathered after church, the talk often turned to the prices at the store. A sack of flour that sold cheaply in distant cities cost double here. A yard of cloth that might be bought for pennies elsewhere cost nickels in the company's store. The women shook their heads, but they had little choice. Children were quick to notice what the shelves held beyond reach. There were candies wrapped in paper, little tin whistles, wooden dolls. They lingered by the counter, staring at the toys, tugging at their mothers' skirts. But more often than not, their mothers pulled them away, murmuring that such things were not for them. A child might receive a peppermint stick once or twice a year, and it was remembered as a treasure long after it was gone. The company store taught even the young what it meant to want and not to have. For the men, the store was a mirror of their labor underground. In the mine, they swung picks, loaded carts, and breathed dust until their lungs burned, all for the sake of wages that never seemed enough. At the store, they saw the fruits of that labor vanish into ledgers, their pay swallowed by inflated prices. They walked out with heavy sacks but light hearts, knowing that the debt followed them home. A week's work might end with only a handful of coins left in their pockets, and sometimes with none at all. The store's power lay not in chains or threats, but in the quiet arithmetic of survival. It kept men returning to the mine because their families depended on it. It kept families tied to the town because the store was the only source of food. Even when discontent brewed, when men whispered about strikes or better wages, the shelves of the store reminded them that rebellion came at a cost they could scarcely afford. Hunger was the most loyal enforcer the company possessed. Some tried to resist in small ways. A few men set snares in the woods, hoping to catch rabbits. Others planted small gardens behind their houses, coaxing beans, potatoes, and onions from the thin soil. Women traded with neighbors, swapping loaves of bread for eggs, or sharing what little they had to stretch meals further. But none of these efforts could fully escape the reach of the store. Even when families scraped together food on their own, they still needed coal oil for lamps, flour for bread, nails for mending roofs, cloth for sewing clothes. The store remained the axis around which their lives turned. The company knew this well. Its managers did not need to shout orders or impose strict rules. The prices themselves spoke loudly enough. A rise in the cost of flour meant hunger. A rise in the cost of coal oil meant darkness in the homes. The miners might grumble, but they paid because there was no alternative. The nearest independent town might be a day's journey away. And without real currency, even that distant freedom was out of reach. There were moments when the injustice showed itself most clearly. A man might fall ill, too weak to descend into the mine. His wages would vanish, but his family still needed food. The store continued to provide, adding each purchase to the ledger, each debt growing heavier. When the man returned to work, he found himself already far behind, digging not only coal, but also his way out of a hole that grew deeper with every bite of bread. In this way, illness was not simply a matter of health, but of debt that could shadow a family for years. For widows, the burden was harsher still. When a miner was killed in an accident underground, the store did not close its doors in sympathy. The widow might be offered credit, but always at the same inflated prices, always added to the same unforgiving ledger. Her children would grow thin, their shoes worn, their faces pale. Neighbors shared what they could, but most had little to spare. The store, unmoved, continued its trade, a place where sorrow translated into numbers in a book. Yet the townspeople endured. Each Saturday, they walked to the store with tokens in their pockets, hope in their steps, resignation in their faces. They stood in line, waiting their turn, listening to the murmur of neighbors, the shuffle of feet, the scratch of the clerk's pen. The ritual was as familiar as prayer, and just as necessary. Families carried their sacks home, children trotting beside them, the goods divided and stored with care. A loaf of bread was sliced thin, beans soaked overnight, salt pork stretched to flavor pots of stew. Meals were meager but steady, enough to keep bodies working, enough to send men back to the mine each morning. The company store became more than a place of trade. It was the heart of the town's unspoken contract. Labor in exchange for survival, survival always balanced against debt. It was where the company's power revealed itself most plainly, not in the roar of machinery or the whistle of the mine, but in the quiet act of weighing flour on a scale, of writing numbers in a ledger, of handing over tokens that never left the company's reach. And so the store stood, day after day, its shelves stocked, its counters polished, its ledgers filling with the lives of men and women who had no other choice. The black dust filled their lungs. The store emptied their pockets. Between the mine and the counter, between the tunnels underground and the sacks of flour above, stretched the unbroken line of control. In that line, families lived and died, never free of the arithmetic that bound them as surely as the coal seams beneath the hills. A miner leaving the pay office did not always feel richer. His hands might close around slips of paper or round tokens pressed into his palm, but the sensation was never the same as holding real money. Scrip had a curious weight to it, not heavy, like silver, not crisp, like a dollar bill, but heavy all the same, because it carried with it the invisible chain of the company's control. The tokens were stamped with the mine's name, their edges worn smooth by passing from hand to hand. The paper chits were fragile, easy to tear, yet treated with more care than any coin, for they were the only proof of wages earned. To the eye of an outsider, they might have looked like trinkets, playthings from a carnival. To a miner, they were survival itself, though survival that always came with strings attached. The company preferred scrip because it kept the circle unbroken. Real money could wander. Real money could travel down the road to a town where prices were fair, where independence was possible. Real money could be saved in a jar, hidden beneath a floorboard, passed to a neighbor without the company's knowledge. But scrip was obedient. It could be spent only where the company allowed, only in the store that carried its prices, only for the goods that it stocked on its shelves. The tokens went out from the pay office and returned again, like coal cars rolling endlessly on a loop of track. A miner knew this instinctively. He would weigh the scrip in his palm, glance down at the familiar stamp, and understand that he was already half in debt before he had even walked home. His wife would be waiting, her apron dusted with flour, her eyes weary but steady. She would take the tokens, turn them over in her hands, and begin to calculate what could be bought, what must be left behind, what debt would grow in the ledger. The children would hover close, curious, hopeful for a sweet or a treat, though they often knew better than to ask. The weight of the scrip was not measured in ounces but in decisions. how much flour to buy, how much salt pork to stretch through the week, whether there would be sugar for the Sunday tea. A pair of boots might be needed, but the tokens would not cover it. Cloth for new shirts might be long overdue, but it would wait again. The scrip was never enough, because it was designed never to be enough. Its very nature was scarcity. Some men tried to hold a token back, slipping it into a pocket, carrying it like a talisman. It gave the illusion of savings, a small coin of hope that perhaps one day could add up to more. But the company's grip was strong. A sudden need for medicine, a broken lamp, a torn coat in winter, all of it drew the token out again. The miners learned that saving scrip was like trying to cup water in their hands. Sooner or later, it leaked away. There were whispers, always whispers, of men who tried to trade scrip outside the town. A farmer in the countryside might accept it at half its value, knowing he could carry it back to the store and redeem it. A traveling peddler might take a few tokens in exchange for trinkets or tools, though always at a steep bargain. But such trades were dangerous, and the company discouraged them with quiet force. The scrip, like the mine itself, was meant to remain within the company's circle. In the pay office, clerks recorded the amounts carefully, subtracting fees for rent, for tools, for advances taken earlier. A miner might step up expecting a week's wage and walk away with only half of what he had imagined, the rest already consumed by debts he could not escape. The scrip that remained in his hand carried not triumph but resignation. He would not hold it aloft as a prize, but carry it home silently, knowing that most of it was already spoken for. For the children of the town, the tokens were strange objects, stamped with letters they learned to read before they ever saw a proper dollar. They would turn them over in their small hands, stack them, pretend to buy and sell with them in games on the porch. Yet even they sensed that the tokens were different, less bright than the coins they sometimes glimpsed in the pockets of strangers who passed through on trains. The scrip belonged to the company, and by belonging to the company, it marked everyone who used it as belonging to. The weight of the scrip was also in what it could not buy. It could not buy freedom, could not buy passage to another town, could not buy the right to walk away from the mine. A miner who dreamed of saving enough to leave found himself always caught short. The tokens added up to food and clothing, to oil and tools, but they never stretched to land, to travel, to a new beginning. The circle closed in on itself week after week, year after year, until the miner's pockets were as empty as his lungs. The company's men knew this, and they did not hide it. The scrip was defended as convenience, as safety, as a way to ensure families were never left without necessities. But in truth, it was a leash. It tethered every worker to the town, every family to the store, every purchase to the company's profit. And because it carried the company's name stamped into its metal, it reminded everyone who truly owned their labor, their homes, even their hunger. At the end of the day, when lamps flickered in the windows and families sat at their tables, the tokens were already gone. They had turned into bread on the plate, beans simmering in a pot, cloth folded in a chest. The miner's hand, once heavy with scrip, was light again, and the cycle waited to begin anew with the next descent into the earth. The weight of the scrip was not in its lasting value, but in its disappearance, its steady transformation into debt, its vanishing act that left only exhaustion behind. And so the tokens passed from hand to hand, from clerk to miner, from wife to child, from counter back to ledger, carrying always the same invisible burden. They were not currency, but reminder that in a company town, even money did not belong to the people who earned it. It belonged to the same force that owned the hills, the mines, the houses, the store. To hold scrip was to hold a piece of one's own captivity, stamped neatly into metal, fragile as paper, heavy as stone. The scrip, once exchanged for food and oil, never stretched far enough to soften the home a miner returned to at dusk. Houses in the company town were not built for comfort. They were built for containment. Rough boards, thin walls, a roof that groaned with every change of weather. These were the dwellings that lined the narrow lanes, huddled close by the railroad tracks that carried coal away. The company called them houses, but most miners called them shacks. They stood in rows like teeth set into the mud, each one nearly identical to the next. A square box, a single chimney, a porch that sagged beneath its own weight. Families filled them as best they could, patching cracks with scraps of cloth, stuffing rags into the spaces where wind whistled through. Inside, the air smelled of coal dust and kerosene, mingled with the faint, sour odor of damp wood that never truly dried. Trains rattled by at all hours, the sound carrying through the thin walls. The ground trembled each time a line of cars rolled past, iron wheels singing against the rails. Sleep came lightly in such a place. A child would stir at the passing of a midnight train, roll over on a straw mattress, and drift again into uneasy dreams. Mothers grew used to the noise, though the constant shaking left a faint restlessness in them, as if the earth itself could not settle. The company owned every house, just as it owned the store and the mine. Rent was deducted before a man ever touched his wages. A miner could not fall behind, because the pay clerk made certain of it. The very roof above his family's head belonged not to him, but to the company that had already taken his sweat, his breath, and his coin. A notice posted on the door, written in a clerk's neat hand, was enough to remind him that the shack could be taken away as swiftly as it was given. In winter, the walls leaked cold. Families huddled close to the stove, feeding it with scraps of coal gathered from the ground or borrowed from the mine's piles. The stove glowed red at its center, but the corners of the room remained icy. Children wore coats indoors, their breath visible as they played near the hearth. Blankets, patched and repatched, could never fully keep out the draft that slipped under the door and whined through the gaps in the boards. In summer, heat pressed into the rooms until the air grew heavy. Dust coated everything: floors, dishes, clothing hung to dry. Women swept daily, sometimes twice, but the black powder returned with every gust of wind, with every passing train, with every shirt a miner carried home from the pit. The dust settled into lungs just as it settled into curtains and bedding, and coughing became a sound as familiar as the whistle of the engines. The houses were built quickly, cheaply, and close together. Privacy was thin as the walls. A quarrel in one shack could be heard in the next. Laughter carried down the row, the crying of a baby, joined by the wail of another farther off. Neighbors knew one another's business, whether they wished to or not. In such closeness, communities formed, bound by shared hardship, but also by the knowledge that none could rise far above the rest. Children made games of the mud outside, drawing shapes with sticks, chasing each other between the houses. They grew up with the rhythm of the mine, learning early to read the expressions on their fathers' faces as they trudged home at dusk. The shacks did not shield them from the truth of the town. Instead, they brought them closer to it. A boy of 10 could tell by the sound of his father's cough whether another year underground was possible. A girl could measure the weight of debt in her mother's sigh as she folded the worn clothes once again. At night, lamps burned low, a single flame of kerosene, guarded carefully through long shadows across the walls. Families gathered around it, the glow falling on tired faces, hands roughened from work, eyes dulled by exhaustion. Stories might be told, or a hymn sung softly, but the weight of the day always pressed heavier than the sound of voices. When the lamp was turned down, darkness swallowed the room quickly, and the trains kept rolling by, unseen but never unheard. Some shacks leaned over time, their foundations giving way to the damp earth. Porches sagged, roofs warped, chimneys cracked. Families patched them as best they could, though repairs were little more than gestures. Tar paper nailed to holes, tin sheets laid over leaks, rope pulling walls back into place. The company rarely invested in fixing the homes. As long as they stood upright enough to hold a family, they served their purpose. The railroad tracks, running so close to the rows of houses, were both a lifeline and a reminder. Coal cars rattled past, carrying the wealth of the hills away to distant cities. Families watched them from their porches, knowing that none of that wealth would remain. The sound of the wheels was the sound of their labor leaving, the sound of profit rolling out of reach. And when the cars passed, the town settled again into its uneasy stillness, with only the lingering dust as proof they had ever been there. Occasionally, a stranger might step off the train, a salesman, a government inspector, a relative visiting from a far-off town. To such eyes, the shacks looked pitiful, their narrow walls and sagging roofs a mark of poverty. But for the miners' families, they were simply home. They knew no other. The walls that rattled in the wind, the floors that creaked beneath bare feet, the stove that smoked and hissed. These were the background of their days, the silent stage on which their lives unfolded. When a miner died, the family was often told to vacate quickly. The shack belonged to the company, and without wages to cover rent, there was no place for them. Widows packed belongings into crates, children carried bundles under their arms, and another family moved in before the walls had even cooled from the stove's last fire. The houses did not mourn, did not remember. They simply held the next set of weary bodies, the next family bound by debt and necessity. For those who lived in them, the shacks by the tracks were more than buildings. They were symbols of permanence and impermanence all at once. Permanent because they tied every family to the mine, to the company, to the endless cycle of labor and scrip. Impermanent because at any moment they could be lost, taken away, reclaimed for another. Their thin boards echoed with the fragility of the lives within them, lives balanced always on the edge of survival. The trains passed again and again, carrying coal away, shaking the walls, unsettling the earth beneath. And each time, the shacks stood, leaning, creaking, rattling, but still there, bearing witness to another day survived, another night endured. The people inside them rose with the whistle, returned with the dusk, and slept lightly to the sound of iron wheels. The houses belonged to the company, but the memories they held belonged to the families who struggled within their narrow rooms, marking time in a town built on debt and coal. Morning in the town did not begin with the sun. The light might have crept over the ridge, spreading across the hills, but the miners' lives were ordered by a sound that cut through both darkness and day. It was the bell, iron, heavy, and relentless. Hung high on its frame near the mouth of the mine, it tolled with a voice that carried across the rows of shacks, across the yards of beaten mud, across the very walls that trembled at the sound. The bell did not ring with ceremony. It was not a church bell calling the faithful to prayer. It was not a clock tower chiming out the hours in a measured city. It was a command, plain and hard. Its note was the voice of the company, summoning men from their homes and pulling them down into the earth. When it rang, doors opened, boots stepped into the mud, and men walked silently toward the shaft. Children stirred when they heard it, even if it came before dawn. They knew what it meant. The day was beginning, though not for them. Wives stirred pots on stoves, laying out small breakfasts of bread or porridge, food that often tasted of coal dust despite every effort to keep the black powder away. Men ate quickly, chewing in silence, their eyes dull with fatigue, and then they rose to answer the call. The bell was more than a schedule. It was the metronome of the town's existence. Its ringing meant wages would be earned, debts would be paid or deepened, and life would continue another day. To ignore it was impossible. To resist it was unthinkable. The bell sounded, and men obeyed. The walk to the mine was not long. The shacks had been built deliberately near the shaft so that the company could keep its workforce close. A path of trodden earth led down toward the structures clustered around the entrance. The tipple, the office, the lamp house. Men gathered there, carrying lunch pails dented with use, wearing clothes that had been washed but never looked clean. Coal dust clung to the seams of every shirt, every pair of trousers, every jacket. Boots were patched and repatched, soles nailed tight to stretch one more season. As the men gathered, the bell still echoed faintly, reverberating in the air. Its sound carried a sense of finality. Once it rang, There was no turning back until the whistle at the end of the shift called them home. Wives stood at doorways, some watching their husbands disappear down the path, others staying inside to clear dishes and ready the day's work. Children, peering from windows, saw their fathers leave with expressions they could not yet read, the mixture of resignation, fear, and routine that only adulthood fully revealed. The entrance to the mine loomed like a wound in the hillside. Black timbers framed its mouth, damp air spilling out in a steady breath. Lanterns glowed dimly in the early light as men checked their equipment. Helmets were adjusted, lamps tested, picks carried over shoulders. The bell's command had drawn them here, and now the earth itself seemed to open, ready to swallow them for another day. Some shifts began in darkness, long before the sun rose, when frost still clung to the edges of the tracks and the air cut sharp in the lungs. Others began at midday or late at night, for the mine never slept. Coal was needed at all hours, and the company's demand was ceaseless. Whenever the bell rang, whether under starlight or sunlight, men came. For those who heard it daily, the bell became more than sound. It was a weight, pressing into their chests, reminding them of obligations they could not escape. A miner might dream of it, the clang echoing in his sleep, only to wake and hear it truly sounding. Its voice blurred the line between rest and labor, between private life and the life demanded by the company. The bell also carried danger in its tone. A prolonged, frantic ringing meant disaster underground, a collapse, a fire, an explosion. Then the town would rush toward the shaft, women and children gathering near the entrance, waiting for news with faces pale against the smoke and dust. But on ordinary days, its steady toll was simply the sound of survival, harsh but familiar. Those who lived by its call seldom questioned it aloud. They rose, they walked, they descended, they came home again, if the day allowed. In this rhythm, the bell became part of the body itself, its metallic voice weaving into breath and heartbeat. The silence between its tolls was as much a reminder as the sound itself, for men knew it would ring again soon, summoning them without mercy. Around the town, everything was timed to it. Women did laundry in the hours between its calls, their hands raw from lye and cold water. Children walked to the schoolhouse, though their lessons often felt secondary to the mine's demands. The trains that rattled past seemed almost to echo its cadence, iron wheels matching the inevitability of iron sound. When evening came and the shift was over, men returned home carrying the day's dust in every crease of their skin. The bell did not ring then. The end of work was marked instead by the whistle, high and sharp, cutting across the valley. But in its absence, the memory of the morning bell lingered. Even in the quiet, the ear anticipated it, waiting for the moment when it would call again. Some men tried to imagine silence, life in a place without that summons. But silence was foreign to them. The bell had become the measure of their existence. Without it, time itself seemed unmoored. Its sound gave shape to the endless days, even as it bound them tighter to the mine. The shacks by the tracks, rattling in the wind, stood as mute witnesses to its rule. Every man who left them in the morning did so at the bell's command. Every child who grew up in their narrow rooms learned to mark the hours by its clang. The bell was as constant as the dust in the air, as the trains on the rails, as the debt in the company's books. It was the voice of labor, of necessity, of inevitability. And so each day began the same. The iron bell, the shuffle of boots, the slow procession toward the earth. The sun might rise or not. The weather might change. The faces might grow older, thinner, wearier. But the bell remained, its sound rolling across the valley, calling men underground as though the hills themselves demanded tribute. The bell had called, the boots had gathered, and now the men stepped into the waiting cage, its wooden slats damp with years of breath and dust. A chain rattled, a signal was given, and the machinery groaned to life. Slowly, the cage descended into the shaft, carrying its load of men into a darkness that swallowed sound, light, and time. Each man carried a lantern, the small flame protected within glass, its glow faint but essential. Without it, The blackness underground was absolute, pressing against the eyes until it felt like blindness. The lantern was more than light. It was life. A flicker in the flame told of air gone bad, a warning that could not be ignored. A steady glow gave a fragile comfort, a promise that breath and sight would last a little longer. The descent was slow, the walls of the shaft sliding past in damp layers of timber and rock. Water dripped steadily, tapping on helmets and shoulders, falling onto boots that would soon be coated in mud. Voices were hushed, words few. The further the cage sank, the more the outside world seemed to vanish, until all that remained was the anticipation of the work ahead. At the bottom, the cage stopped with a jolt. Men stepped off, boots sinking into wet ground, lanterns swaying in their hands. The tunnels stretched before them, narrow passages cut into the rock, supported by beams blackened with soot and age. The air was close, heavy with the scent of earth and coal dust, carrying the faint tang of gas that lurked unseen. The lanterns bobbed as the men moved, their glow casting trembling shadows on the walls. The light revealed only what was close. A few feet of track, a glistening wall of coal, the face of another man. Beyond that, there was nothing but dark. The darkness pressed against the edge of the light, thick and unyielding, as though the mine itself resented intrusion. Work began quickly. Picks struck against stone, shovels scraped, carts creaked as they filled. The lanterns swung with the rhythm of the labor, their light jerking back and forth, making the shadows dance in uneasy patterns. A man could work for hours and never see beyond the circle of his own flame. Time was measured not by the sun, which never reached here, but by the ache in the back, the weight in the arms. The muffled signals shouted through the tunnels. The deeper one went, the closer the air grew. Breathing felt different underground, thicker, slower. Dust coated the throat, settled into the lungs, clung to the sweat on a man's face. Each inhalation carried the grit of the coal itself, as though the mine was slowly filling the body from within. A cough echoed off the walls, swallowed by the darkness, and then the sound of picks resumed. In the tunnels, lantern light played tricks. A glimmer on wet stone could resemble an open space, only to vanish when approached. A shadow could seem to move, though nothing stood there. Miners learned not to trust what they thought they saw, relying instead on the steady flame, on the familiar lines of beams and tracks, on the feel of the earth beneath their boots. The silence of the mine was never complete. There was always sound, the drip of water, the rasp of breath, the crunch of boots, the distant rumble of carts being pushed. Yet all of it seemed muted, muffled by the weight of rock above. Sometimes the earth itself groaned, a deep rumble that vibrated through the timbers, making men pause in uneasy stillness. Then, as quickly as it came, the sound would fade and the work would resume, lanterns swaying like restless stars in a low sky. A lantern flame was fragile. A gust of bad air could dim it suddenly, shrinking it to a flicker, warning of danger invisible and deadly. The men watched their flames closely. A steady burn meant safety or something near to it. A wavering light meant gas, the unseen enemy that could choke or explode with the strike of a spark. Many carried their fear silently, but all carried it. A man's eyes flickered as often to his flame as to his work. Lunch came in the same darkness, eaten by lantern light. Men sat on overturned carts or rough-hewn beams, unwrapping bread, cold meat, or pie carried from home. Dust clung to every bite. Water or coffee was sipped from tin containers, the liquid tasting faintly of coal no matter how clean. Conversation was quiet, words carried just far enough for those nearby. Beyond the small circle of light, the blackness remained unchanged, eternal, waiting. The endless dark was more than a condition of the mine. It was a condition of the body. Eyes strained to adjust, never fully succeeding. Skin felt the weight of the air, the damp that seeped into clothes, the grit that clung to hair. After hours in the tunnels, a man might close his eyes and see only lantern flames, still dancing, still wavering against the void. Accidents were common, though not always spoken of. A timber might crack, sending stone crashing into a passage. A pocket of gas might ignite, lantern flames flaring for an instant before vanishing forever. In such moments, the darkness became absolute again, swallowing screams and silence alike. Survivors remembered only the sudden loss of light, the sensation of being swallowed whole by the earth. Yet day after day, men descended again. They stepped into the cage, carried their lanterns, and disappeared into the tunnels. The outside world shrank behind them, the sun forgotten, the sky erased. Underground, the lantern was the only sun, its glow marking a fragile defiance against the endless dark. When the shift ended, the cage rose once more, carrying men back toward the surface. Lanterns were extinguished, the flames snuffed out one by one, leaving behind only the memory of their glow. Emerging into daylight was a shock each time, the sun harsh after the hours of dim flicker. Eyes squinted, lungs filled with air that, though tinged with dust, felt free in comparison. The lanterns were written, checked, and hung in neat rows for the next descent. Their glass was smudged, their metal dented, their flames exhausted. Yet tomorrow they would burn again, carried once more into the blackness that never ended, the darkness that cared nothing for the lives that flickered against it. Above ground, the train still rattled past, the shacks still leaned against the wind, and the bell still waited to call again. But beneath it all, the mine remained, silent until disturbed, endless in its shadows, waiting for the next lantern to pierce its depths. The fashions, the flame in the lantern gave just enough light to see the tool in a man's hands. The pick rested heavy on the shoulder, its iron head worn smooth with use, its handle darkened by sweat and dust. The shovel leaned nearby, ready to scoop the broken stone, to move the earth that resisted every stroke. These were the instruments of survival, simple in form, yet brutal in purpose. They measured out the miner's life, not in hours or wages, but in the strength that drained from his arms with each swing. The tunnels demanded rhythm. The pick struck the wall, a dull thud followed by the crack of stone. The shovel scraped, the coal clattered into carts. Again and again, the motions repeated, until muscle and bone moved, as if guided by instinct rather than will. A miner learned to match his breath to the swing, to pace himself so the hours could be endured. There was no end to the wall of coal. Breaking it apart was not a task to finish, only a task to continue, day after day, until the body gave out. Silence filled the spaces between the sounds. In the dim glow of lanterns, men worked side by side, their faces streaked black, their shirts soaked with sweat. Words were rare, speaking wasted breath, and in the close air, every breath mattered. A cough might break the stillness, echoing off the walls. The scrape of metal, the rattle of carts, the drip of water, these sounds became the language of the mine, a vocabulary of survival. The pick cut deeper, chipping away at the seam. Each blow seemed small, but over hours it carved tunnels into the earth, tunnels where the darkness grew heavier, where the air thinned and the silence pressed harder. A man felt his arms numb with effort, his shoulders burn, his back tighten. He stopped only to shovel, to move the broken coal into the cart that waited like an empty mouth. Then the work began again. Pick and shovel, pick and shovel, the rhythm unending. Tools were not possessions in the company town. They were issued, borrowed, replaced when broken. A miner's pick might last years, its handle worn smooth as bone, its head chipped from countless strikes, the shovel bent with time, its edge dulled by stone, its handle scarred from use. These tools bore the memory of every shift, every swing, every moment when the silence of the tunnels pressed close. The silence underground was not absence but presence. It pressed into the ears, filled the spaces between heartbeats, made every sound sharper. The ring of a pick against stone carried farther than it should have. The rattle of a cartwheel seemed louder than a shout. Even footsteps felt heavy, their echoes rolling along the tunnels, as though the mine itself listened. Men grew attuned to that silence, learning to hear what it carried. A faint crack in the rock could be a warning. The creak of a timber might mean the ceiling was shifting. A sudden change in the pitch of a dripping sound could tell of water building somewhere unseen. The silence spoke constantly, but only those who lived within it could interpret its language. Work wore the body down quickly. Sweat poured in the stale air, mixing with dust until it ran black across the skin. Muscles strained, lungs ached, fingers blistered. Yet the rhythm continued. Pick, shovel, silence. A miner could not think of the hours ahead. He could only think of the next swing, the next load, the next breath of air. The mind narrowed to the task, to the tunnel, to the circle of lantern light. Sometimes, a cart would be filled and pushed back along the narrow track, wheels squealing, metal clanging. New carts would arrive, empty and waiting, ready to be fed again. The men pushing them worked in silence too, their footsteps steady, their faces smeared, their hands gripping the rough wood. They moved in and out of the darkness like shadows, their lanterns bobbing, their presence acknowledged but seldom spoken to. Lunch came and went, a brief pause in the rhythm. Bread, meat, a sip of water, all eaten by lantern light with hands still blackened by dust. Then the pick was lifted again, the shovel put back to use, the silence returning as constant as before. There was no escape from it, no relief except in the thought that eventually the whistle would sound and the day would end. The mine offered no horizon. A man never looked up to see sky, never looked out to see distance. His world was the tunnel, the wall of coal, the flicker of his lantern. Days blurred together, the only measure of time the ache that deepened in his body, the pile of coal that grew in the carts. In such a world, the pick and shovel were not tools. They were extensions of the self, as much a part of the miner as his hands or breath. Yet even in the rhythm, danger remained constant. A misjudged swing could strike a pocket of gas, a hidden seam that released death into the tunnel. A weakened timber could collapse, burying tools and men alike beneath stone. The silence after such moments was heavier than any before, broken only by shouts or the sound of scrambling feet. Then, if the air cleared and the ground held, the rhythm resumed, as if the mine demanded its due and then permitted the survivors to continue. The silence of the mine followed the men home. At night, lying in their shacks, they felt it in their bones, the stillness pressing into their dreams. Even the sound of trains passing could not dislodge it. The silence of the tunnels became part of them, inseparable, lingering in the lungs and ears long after the shift was done. Generations passed the rhythm down. Boys who watched their fathers swing the pick grew into men who did the same. The tools changed little. The motions changed less. The silence remained, broken only by the same sounds, repeated endlessly. Pick, shovel, silence. The pattern echoed through decades, binding lives to the mine in an unending cycle. Above ground, the world moved on. Trains carried coal away. Debts mounted. Families struggled. But underground, in the lantern light, the world stood still. Every day was the same. The swing of the pick, the scrape of the shovel, the silence that never lifted. In that silence, the mine kept its secrets, holding them close, waiting for the moment when the earth would remind men of its power. And so the rhythm continued, as steady as breath, as inevitable as debt. Pick, shovel, silence. The unbroken song of the company town, echoing beneath the hills, carried in the bodies of those who labored, etched into the bones of the earth itself. The tunnels did not breathe as men did. The air within them was stale, unmoving, a substance that seemed to grow heavier with every step. To draw it into one's chest was to take in more than oxygen. Each breath carried fine particles of coal, invisible but constant, clinging to the throat, settling in the lungs, leaving behind a weight that never lifted. The miner's chest was a cavern, filling slowly with black dust, grain by grain, until even rest could not ease it. The lamps glowed faintly, their light dancing in the haze that hung in the tunnels. A man's breath turned visible, not as mist, but as a faint disturbance in the dust that shimmered before the flame. To inhale deeply was to taste grit, to feel it scrape along the tongue, to swallow without meaning to. Coughs echoed in the dark, sharp and ragged, cutting through the silence like pick strikes. They were not the coughs of illness alone. They were the soundtrack of existence, as unavoidable as the swing of the shovel. The mine was a closed world. The deeper the men went, the less air moved. Stagnant spaces gathered the fumes of their own bodies, sweat and breath mingling with the invisible gases that seeped from the stone. Fire damp, black damp, stink damp. Words whispered with unease, words that meant more than discomfort. They meant death waiting, silent and unseen, in a tunnel that looked no different from the rest. The flicker of a flame could betray it, a lamp burning blue, a sudden extinguishing, a hiss in the silence. The men had no defense but awareness, no shield but instinct. Every breath carried risk. Black damp stole the oxygen, leaving only suffocation. Fire damp waited for a spark, ready to turn the tunnel into a furnace. Coal dust itself could hang so thick in the air that a single strike might ignite it, turning the silence into a roar. The fear of breathing was constant, but there was no choice. To stop was to suffocate, to continue was to choke, and between these two paths lay the daily labor of life. A miner's lungs bore the memory of every shift. The dust settled deep, beyond what coughing could expel. Over years, the chest grew tighter, the breath shorter, the coughs more frequent. Some called it miner's lung, others black lung, but names mattered little to those who felt their breath grow shallow long before age should have taken it. Men grew used to gasping, to resting with their hands on their knees, to nights spent coughing in their shacks until sleep came from exhaustion more than peace. Fear sharpened the senses. A faint smell of rotten eggs could mean poison gas. A sudden stillness in the air could mean suffocation was near. The men learned to notice these signs, to read the language of the tunnels. Yet the signs did not always come in time. Collapsed bodies on the floor told the rest of the story, their lamps still glowing beside them, their tools dropped mid-swing. The mine gave no warning more generous than that. Children felt the weight of the air too. Boys sent into the tunnels as trappers or drivers grew up with lungs already lined in soot. Their small bodies adapted quickly, but the dust settled just as deeply. By the time they were men, their breathing carried the sound of age, wheezing like bellows, their coughs dry and relentless. They never knew what it was to fill the lungs with clean air, never knew the ease of drawing breath without effort. Above ground, the sky stretched wide, the air sharp and fresh in the hills. But for the families of the company town, the mine's breath followed them home. Coal dust clung to clothes, hair, and skin, carried into the shacks where it settled into bedding, onto food, into water. Children breathed it before they could walk. Women swept it from floors, washed it from faces, shook it from sheets, but it always returned, blackening every corner. The air outside was never fully clean. The mine exhaled constantly through its shafts, spreading its dust across the town like a shadow that could not be escaped. Inside the tunnels, fear and labor were inseparable. A man's hand tightened on the handle of his shovel not only from effort, but from the awareness that his next breath might carry more than dust. The silence became heavier, filled with waiting, as though the mine itself chose when to give and when to take. There were no guarantees. A man could walk into a tunnel healthy and strong, and before the shift was over, he might be carried out limp, his lungs filled with gas he never saw. The company provided little in the way of safety. Ventilation was promised but seldom sufficient. Timbers propped open airways but did not purify them. Men were expected to endure, to carry on despite the choking air, to accept that the mine took what it wanted. Masks were rare, filters rarer still, and those that existed were crude and unreliable. The belief was simple. Coal was worth more than breath. and men could be replaced more easily than seams. The miners themselves developed rituals of caution. They carried canaries, small birds whose fragile lungs faltered before a man's would. When the bird fell silent, the men knew danger had arrived. Some used mice or candles, watching the flame for changes in color or life. These were the only alarms they had, the only defenses against air thick enough to kill. Yet even with such warnings, survival was never assured. Fear did not always shout. Sometimes it whispered. The fear of waking in the night unable to draw a full breath. The fear of coughing until blood appeared. The fear of watching fathers and brothers waste away in their 30s or 40s, their lungs too tired to carry them further. These fears did not explode like fire damp. They lingered, heavy and constant, like the dust in the air. The body adapted to the mind's demands, but adaptation did not mean safety. Men learned to breathe shallowly, to pace themselves, to ignore the constant itch in their throats. They grew accustomed to the rattle in their chests, to spitting black into the dust at their feet. They learned to swallow fear as they swallowed dust, pushing it deeper, burying it where it could not interfere with the rhythm of work. But buried fear still remained, pressing in like the air itself, inescapable and suffocating. The mine had a way of teaching humility. No matter how strong a man's arms, no matter how steady his hands, the air reminded him that strength alone could not save him. Breath was fragile, fleeting, dependent on forces beyond his control. The walls might hold, the roof might stay firm, but the air itself could betray him, turning from life to death in a single breath. And yet the work continued. The carts filled, the picks swung, the shovels scraped. Men carried their fear as they carried their tools, shouldering it as part of the load. The company town depended on that labor, on lungs willing to draw in dust, on bodies willing to keep moving even when every inhale cut deeper. Survival meant enduring, not conquering, and endurance came at the cost of breath. Above ground, families listened for the whistle, praying for its sound to bring their men home safe. But even when they returned, coughing and weary, the fear was never gone. It lingered in the night, in the sound of shallow breathing, in the echo of a cough that would not stop. The mine lived inside them, not just in their muscles or their debts, but in their lungs, in the very air they carried within. The company town was not only built on coal, it was built on breath, borrowed breath, breath taken and never returned. Each lungful carried the mind deeper into the body, until there was no separation between man and earth. The dust claimed them slowly, fear claimed them constantly, and still the work went on, for there was no other choice. The tunnels exhaled their silence, and the men inhaled their fate. Air thick with coal and fear filled every chest, every home, every corner of life in the town. It was the one thing that could not be escaped, the invisible chain that bound them all, drawing tighter with every breath. The descent began before the sun had fully risen. Men gathered at the mouth of the shaft, their faces pale in the early light, eyes red from broken sleep. Some stood silently, tools in hand, their bodies leaning forward as though pulled by gravity toward the darkness below. Others coughed into their palms, their breath clouding faintly in the cool morning air before they stepped into the structure that would carry them away from it. It was called a cage, though its bars were of iron and its frame clanged like a prison door. 4 walls, open enough to see through, but confining all the same. The men stepped into it shoulder to shoulder, pressed close until there was no space left to move, their bodies swaying as one mass. They were herded by necessity, not cruelty, though the effect was the same. The cage made prisoners of them all, binding them together in silence. A bell rang, a signal to the engineer above. The steel cables tightened, groaned, and the cage trembled. The men lowered their heads slightly, an instinct more than a choice, as though bracing for a blow. Then came the jolt, and the descent began. The shaft swallowed them. At first, a brief rush of cool air stirred through the bars, the last breath of the world above. It carried with it the faint smell of grass, wood smoke, and open sky. Then, as the cage slid deeper, the air changed. The freshness thinned, replaced by damp stone, stale moisture, the metallic tang of iron mixed with the faint stench of oil. The men felt it settle into their nostrils, felt the light above shrink until it became a memory. The creaking of the cables was the only constant sound. Water dripped somewhere in the shaft, echoing faintly as it fell from unseen cracks. Now and then the cage scraped against the timbers, sending shivers through its frame. The men did not speak. Voices carried strangely in the shaft, swallowed by the descent, making conversation feel like an intrusion into something sacred or cursed. Silence suited the ritual better. The deeper they went, the darker the air became, not only in sight, but in feeling. The lungs tightened as if reluctant to accept what was offered. It was not yet the suffocating weight of the tunnels, but it carried a promise of what was to come. The descent was a preparation, a slow exchange of one world for another, breath by breath. Light vanished altogether. The cage carried its own faint glow from the lamps the men held, flickering through the bars, casting trembling shadows across their faces. It was enough to see the outline of the man beside you, enough to remember you were not alone, but never enough to break the impression that you were being swallowed whole by the earth. Some men closed their eyes, preferring not to watch the walls slide past. Others stared upward, following the shrinking circle of daylight until it disappeared. A few looked down instead, though there was nothing to see, only blackness waiting, unfathomable and absolute. The descent lasted minutes, though it felt like hours. Time stretched in the shaft, elongated by the slow groan of machinery and the beating of one's own heart. The mind wandered, though always to the same place. The thought of what might happen if the cable snapped, if the cage dropped without restraint. The imagination could not resist. It conjured the plunge, the rush of air, the shouts of men, the final impact. Every creak in the rope carried the weight of that possibility. And still, every morning, they stepped into it again. The cage was not only a means of passage, it was a threshold. Above ground, a man was a father, a husband, a son. He could look at the sky, speak freely, walk where he wished. In the cage, those identities blurred. Descent stripped them away, leaving only the role of miner, one among many, indistinguishable in the dark. The bars enclosed them, the shaft swallowed them, and by the time the cage reached the bottom, the men were no longer themselves. They were shadows among shadows, claimed by the mine. At the pit bottom, the cage shuddered to a halt. The gate clanged open, and the men stepped out into an underworld lit by scattered lamps and the glimmer of wet stone. Here, the air was heavier, thick with the faint taste of coal and smoke from oil lamps. Water pooled underfoot, seeping from the rock, and the sound of dripping joined the clamour of carts and voices. It was a place apart, a world sustained not by sunlight, but by fire, sweat, and machinery. The cage did not rest long. As soon as one load of men stepped off, another stepped in. The rhythm was constant, rising and falling like breath, carrying men into the depths and lifting others toward the surface. Yet it never felt natural. Each trip was a reminder of the distance between the world above and the world below, of the fragile link that bound them together by a single rope and wheel. Men told stories of cages that had failed, a snapped cable, a runaway descent, a crash that left nothing but broken iron and broken bodies at the bottom of the shaft. These tales were whispered, passed between families, spoken in the quiet moments when the whistle was late and fear pressed harder than usual. The stories lingered in every mind as the cage rattled downward. Few spoke of them aloud while inside it, but all carried the knowledge silently. The descent shaped the body as much as the work itself. Knees bent, spines curved, shoulders pressed inward. Men learned to hold themselves in ways that wasted no space, conserving balance as the cage swayed. They breathed shallowly, saving their lungs for what lay below. By the time they stepped onto solid ground again, their bodies were already primed for toil, molded by the ritual of descent. The cage had no mercy for fear. New men, green boys sent to the mine for the first time, gripped the bars until their knuckles whitened. Some trembled, some prayed under their breath, some bit their lips until they bled. The veterans beside them remained still, their faces calm, though their eyes betrayed the same unease. Fear never left, it simply became familiar. The return journey at the end of a shift carried a different weight. The men climbed into the cage with bodies aching, clothes soaked in sweat, lungs burning with dust. They leaned heavily against one another, too tired for words, letting the cage lift them slowly back toward the faint promise of light. Yet even then, relief was tempered by the same thought. The cable could still snap, the rope could still fray. Safety was never guaranteed until the gate opened at the top. Above ground, families waited, listening for the groan of the cage as it rose. Wives stood near the shaft house, children clutched in their arms, watching as the men emerged, blinking and coughing in the daylight. Each return was a small victory, though none celebrated it. To survive the cage was only to face it again the next day. The miners spoke little of the descent, but it lived within them. It marked their dreams. It shaped their silences. It became the threshold they crossed so often that it carved itself into memory. They could feel it even when lying in bed at night. The sway of the cage, the groan of the rope, the long, slow fall into darkness. The cage was not just iron and cable. It was a symbol. It embodied the line between freedom and captivity, between life under the sun and labor in the dark. It carried men not only into the mine, but into a condition of existence that few outside could comprehend. For those who lived in company towns, the cage was as familiar as a church bell, as constant as hunger, as necessary as breath. Every descent was the same, yet each was unique in its weight. The mine might greet them with silence, or with the sudden roar of collapse, or with the hiss of unseen gas. The cage could not prepare them for what awaited. It could only deliver them to it. And so, day after day, the men stepped inside, hands gripping iron, hearts steadying themselves, as the earth swallowed them once more. In time, the descent became more than routine. It became a surrender, a ritual offering of self to the depths. To step into the cage was to accept the darkness, the dust, the danger, and to acknowledge that survival was never promised. The cage lowered men not just into shadows, but into the very heart of the life they could not escape. The mine had its own way of keeping secrets. Stone collapsed in the dark, fire flickered, gas seeped, and when it claimed its price, the earth closed over the sound as if nothing had happened. The noise of disaster was sharp, sudden, terrifying, but it never lingered. Silence rushed back just as quickly, filling the void, pressing down on those who remained. Accidents did not echo for long. They happened, and then they were swallowed, carried away in the same stillness that filled the tunnels every other day. Men understood this silence. They lived inside it, worked beside it, breathed it in as surely as coal dust. It was the silence of survival, of necessity. Words could not change what had already happened, nor could they soften the weight of memory. And so the stories of crushed bodies, of gas-choked lungs, of flames that devoured the air, these were rarely told aloud. They were carried inside instead, unspoken burdens heavier than any cart of coal. The mine offered 100 ways to die, each one sudden, each one final. A timber groaned under pressure, then snapped, and a section of roof collapsed in a rush of stone and coal. A man caught beneath it was gone in an instant, the breath stolen from his lungs before he could cry out. Sometimes there was no body to recover, only fragments, broken tools, and dust marking the spot where he had stood. Gas was quieter, but no less merciless. It drifted unseen into the tunnels, heavier than air, filling the low spaces where men worked. Black damp smothered without warning, leaving a man unconscious, his lamp extinguished in his hand. Fire damp waited for a spark, and when it found one, the tunnels erupted in fire. The blast roared through the shafts, carrying with it burning dust, wood, and flesh. Survivors spoke of the sound as thunder inside the earth, followed by darkness more absolute than any night. Yet even these disasters, when they came, faded quickly into silence. The men returned to work as soon as the company ordered it, stepping back into the same tunnels where their friends had fallen. They did not speak of what they had seen or of what they feared. To do so was to invite despair, and despair was a luxury the company town did not allow. At home, the silence followed them. Wives recognized it in their husbands' eyes, children in their fathers' pauses before answering. A man came back from a shift, not only with coal dust on his skin, but with absence in his words. He might sit at the table, staring at his food without eating, or stand in the doorway listening to the wind without speaking. No one asked what weighed on him. To ask was to risk hearing the truth, and the truth was rarely survivable. The company encouraged silence as well. Records of accidents were kept sparingly, reports written to minimize the scale of loss. Official tallies counted fewer deaths than reality could ever justify, and families were often given little more than a token payment to replace the breadwinner who would never return. Public mourning was discouraged. Strikes might follow if grief grew too loud. It was easier, safer, to let the memory fade beneath the press of necessity. But forgetting was impossible. The mine had ways of reminding those who worked it. A broken lamp still resting where a man had fallen. A bloodstain darkened into the stone. A collapsed tunnel sealed off and avoided, but never erased. Men walked past these markers every day, feeling the weight of absence in the silence, though no one spoke of it aloud. Children learned early that accidents were part of life. They saw coffins carried out of shacks, watched widows dressed in black, heard the muffled sound of weeping behind closed doors. They asked questions at first, but the answers never satisfied. Soon they stopped asking. The silence became their inheritance, just as the mine would be. The mine did not always kill in dramatic ways. Often it maimed instead. A crushed hand, a broken leg, a blinded eye. These injuries were common, and they ended a man's usefulness just as surely as death. Compensation was meager, if given at all, and men unable to work became burdens on their families. They lingered in the town as reminders of what could happen, sitting outside their shacks, coughing, watching others go to the shaft each morning. Their silence was different, resigned, heavy with the knowledge that the mine had already taken the best of them. Superstition grew in the absence of words. Some men believed certain tunnels were cursed, others that the mine itself had moods, growing angry or restless, taking lives when it pleased. They carried charms, whispered prayers before entering the cage, touched the walls with their fingers as though asking permission to pass. These rituals filled the space that speech could not. Fear was not denied, but it was hidden beneath gestures, habits, and the small comforts of routine. Accidents shaped the rhythm of the town, even when no one spoke of them. A whistle might blow at an unusual hour, signaling something had gone wrong. The women would pause in their work, listening, their hands tightening on whatever they held. Children would run to the shaft, hoping for news. Hours later, word would spread quietly. So many men gone, so many injured, and then life would continue, because it had to. Graves multiplied at the edge of the company town. Wooden markers leaned in the wind, their names fading, their dates too close together. Families visited them rarely, not because they did not care, but because visiting stirred what silence had tried to bury. The dead were remembered in daily survival, in the bread earned through danger, in the cough that grew louder each night. The mine had claimed them, and in a sense, it claimed those who remained as well. The silence around accidents was not only about grief, it was also about endurance. To speak of loss was to admit vulnerability, to let the weight of fear settle too heavily on the chest. By keeping quiet, the men convinced themselves they could carry on. It was a fragile deception, but a necessary one. Words had power, and in the tunnels, power was dangerous. Yet silence did not erase memory. In the evenings when lamps were low and children had fallen asleep, wives sometimes heard their husbands whisper in their sleep, names of men long gone, cries choked off before waking. These were the words the daylight never allowed. In dreams, the mind spoke through them, reminding them of the accidents no one dared discuss. The company town itself seemed to carry the silence in its timbers. The shacks leaned close, roofs patched with the same boards that covered coffins. Smoke from chimneys drifted upward without sound, as though the air itself conspired to keep things quiet. Even the laughter of children seemed subdued, muffled by the weight of unspoken truths. To an outsider, the silence might have seemed strange, unnatural. But for those who lived there, it was the only way forward. Speaking of accidents would not fill the cupboards, would not keep the lamps burning, would not bring back the men lost. Silence became the shield, the tool as essential as pick and shovel. It allowed life to continue in the face of loss, too frequent, too devastating to carry otherwise. And so the accidents remained unspoken. They lived in gestures, in the way a man's hand trembled before gripping the bar of the cage, in the pause before a lamp was lit, in the cough that broke the stillness at night. They lived in the empty chairs at tables, in the eyes of widows, in the weary steps of children forced too young into work. The mine kept its secrets, but those who lived in its shadow carried them all the same. Accidents did not vanish. They became part of the town's very air, as thick and inescapable as the coal dust itself. And just like the dust, they settled deep, into lungs, into silence, into memory that never left, though no one dared give it voice. Whispers had a way of spreading in the company town, quiet as the coal dust that settled on every surface, but no less persistent. Men rarely raised their voices in public, yet words travelled all the same. From the corner of a tavern to the shadows of the shaft, from one shack to another as wives carried bread or water, from children who overheard fragments of conversations and repeated them without understanding. The mine was built on silence, but silence was never complete. Beneath it, murmurs lived, waiting for the right moment to swell into something larger. The accidents no one spoke of did not vanish. They pressed against the walls of memory, demanding to be acknowledged. Each broken body, each sudden death, each household left with fewer hands to carry its burden, all of it accumulated. At first, the weight was carried individually, locked inside a man's chest or buried in the quiet grief of a widow. But in time, that weight pressed outward, finding others who carried the same. Shared suffering created recognition, and recognition turned into conversation. The first whispers were cautious, almost embarrassed. Someone might mention unfair wages, the scrip that lost value in the company store, the endless debts that grew heavier with each passing year. Another might reply with a sigh, a muttered agreement, quickly followed by silence. To speak too boldly was dangerous. The company owned not just the mine, but the houses, the store, the very ground beneath one's feet. To defy it openly was to risk eviction, starvation, or worse. Yet the whispers grew all the same, weaving their way through the stillness like a low hum no one admitted hearing. The tavern was where the murmur grew strongest. A few men gathered at rough tables, their faces smeared with the same dust, their hands scarred with the same cuts. They drank what they could afford, sometimes watered-down beer, sometimes nothing stronger than the warmth of companionship. It was in these dimly lit rooms that the first cautious conversations about strikes began. No one used the word directly at first. They spoke instead of fairness, of dignity, of what a man's life ought to be worth. But everyone knew what those words pointed toward. Fear tempered every sentence. The company had its eyes and ears everywhere. Foremen who lingered too long in doorways, store clerks who listened as customers counted their coins, even neighbors who chose loyalty to power over loyalty to one another. Whispers could be reported, and those who spoke too freely might find themselves without work the next morning. Yet even with the danger, men still leaned closer to one another, lowering their voices, sharing their frustrations in tones that were little more than breath. At home, wives spoke too, though in different terms. They measured the company's broken promises against the hunger of their children, the threadbare clothes, the debts that never shrank. They did not talk of strikes in the same way their husbands did, but their silence or their encouragement shaped what came next. A man might hesitate to risk everything, but a woman who had seen too many coffins carried past her door might remind him that survival without dignity was no survival at all. The company, of course, knew of these whispers. It had seen them before in other towns, in other mines. It responded with its own weapons. Promises of improvements, small raises, the delivery of new tools that broke as quickly as the old ones. Officials arrived with polished words, speaking of progress, of safety, of how the company cared for its men like family. These speeches were rehearsed, almost theatrical, and they soothed some for a time. But promises spoken too often without fulfillment eventually curdle into something bitter. The strikes that followed were rarely sudden. They built slowly, like pressure in the tunnels, until the weight could no longer be contained. Men began refusing the extra hours demanded of them, or left their picks hanging on the wall when wages were delayed. Sometimes the strike was no more than a day of silence, men standing outside the shaft with arms folded, lamps unlit, waiting for the company to take notice. Other times it stretched longer, days turning into weeks, the town caught between desperation and defiance. Strikes revealed the fragility of the company town. With the mine silent, everything else grew restless. The store shelves emptied, credit was withheld. Families stretched their food to impossible lengths. Children grew thin, their ribs pressing against skin. The pressure was unbearable, yet still men held out, for to return too soon was to admit defeat. The company responded with tactics as old as industry itself. It brought in replacement workers, outsiders who did not share the town's grief or loyalties. These men were housed in guarded camps, marched to the shaft under the watch of company agents. Their presence an insult to those who refused to bow. Violence sometimes followed. Strikers gathered at the edges of the camps, hurling insults, stones, whatever they could find. The company answered with armed guards, batons, sometimes guns. Blood spilled not only underground, but in the daylight streets of the town. Whispers turned louder in those moments, but so did the company's voice. Newspapers, often controlled or influenced by the same owners, spoke of ungrateful workers and outside agitators, painting men who asked for bread and safety as radicals or criminals. Promises were repeated again, as though words might erase the sight of broken bodies carried home. Yet strikes were not only about wages or hours, they were about recognition, about a man being seen not just as a body to dig coal, but as a human life with worth. Broken promises cut deeper than hunger. When the company swore it would improve conditions and failed, when it raised wages only to raise store prices higher, when it promised safety while allowing deaths to pile up unacknowledged. That betrayal burned hotter than the fires underground. The rhythm of strikes, whispers, and broken promises became part of the town's life, just as much as the accidents and the dust. It was a cycle: suffering, murmurs, defiance, repression, and then the quiet return to the shaft, where the work continued as before. Each time, something shifted. Trust eroded, patience wore thinner, the silence grew heavier. Even when men returned to the tunnels, they carried the memory of those moments of unity, fragile though they were. For children, the strikes were their first lessons in power. They saw their fathers pacing outside the shaft, their mothers stretching meals further than ever before. The tension in every household like a storm waiting to break. Some children cheered when the company yielded a little. Others remembered only the hunger that had gnawed at them. For all of them, it was a reminder that survival in the company town was never guaranteed, no matter how hard one worked. In the quiet that followed a strike, promises echoed longest. Foremen swore that changes were coming, that safety would improve, that wages would rise steadily. For a time, hope flickered. But promises unkept became as much a part of the air as coal dust. settling into lungs heavy and suffocating. Every man knew the feeling of believing once too often, of learning to distrust even kindness when it came from the company's mouth. And yet, despite it all, the whispers never died completely. Even after failed strikes, even after broken promises, even after hunger and eviction, men still found ways to murmur their discontent. It was as though silence itself demanded balance, and the weight of unspoken grief pushed words out again, soft and dangerous. The mine could collapse, the company could betray, the town could starve, but still someone would lean close in a tavern, lower his voice, and ask, "What if we tried again?" The cycle endured, grinding on, each turn leaving scars deeper than the last. Strikes promised change, whispers promised solidarity, and promises from the company promised nothing at all. All of it left the people of the coal town suspended in a world where survival was measured not only by what they endured underground, but also by how much they dared to speak above it. The coal beneath their feet was endless, black and suffocating, and the promises above ground were just as endless, just as suffocating. Between the two, the town existed, caught in whispers, in hunger, in the hollow space where hope and betrayal met again and again. Hunger had its own rhythm in the company town, steady and unrelenting. It was not the sudden kind that gnawed sharply at the belly for a moment and then passed. No, this was slower, quieter. The hunger of days measured in portions too small and debts too large. Bread became the measure of survival, each loaf a reminder of how firmly the company's hand closed around every household. To eat was to submit, to starve was to resist, though no one could hold out for long. The company's store was the heart of this grip, and the workers knew it. You walked there with the dust of the shaft still clinging to your skin, scrip in your pocket, and desperation in your eyes. The shelves looked full, rows of flour, salt pork, dried beans, coal oil, even luxuries like canned peaches or coffee. But the fullness was a trap. The prices shifted like shadows, always higher than you expected, always just beyond the reach of the pay you received. A man could work 12 hours in darkness, and still, by the time his wife came home from the store, the bag she carried would be too light for the labor given. Each purchase deepened the debt. Scrip was never enough. Not when the store charged more for everything than the same goods sold in towns just a few miles away. But those other towns might as well have been oceans distant, for who could afford the wagon, the time, the risk of angering the company by buying elsewhere? So families remained tethered, their diets shaped by what the company allowed. Bread stretched thin with lard, beans boiled again and again until the pot was empty, bacon fat saved in tins to flavor the next meager meal. The bread itself became symbolic, more than sustenance. It was daily proof of dependence. To hold a loaf in your hands was to acknowledge the invisible exchange, your sweat for their control, your life for their profit. And when bread was short, when shelves thinned and prices climbed higher, the reminder of that dependence grew sharper, like a chain pulled tight around the throat. Breath was the other measure of life, though here too the company held sway. Underground, the air belonged to them. Ventilation was promised, fans were installed, shafts cut to draw out the worst of the fumes. But all of it was done cheaply, hastily, with more concern for coal than for the men who clawed it loose. Dust filled lungs, blackening them from within. Gas seeped silently, waiting to ignite. Men coughed in their sleep, their chests rattling like loose stones, and the company called it weakness, not consequence. Above ground, breath was hardly freer. The very houses were choked with soot, the air thick with smoke from the company's own furnaces. Clothes hung outside, turned black within hours. Babies grew up wheezing before they learned to walk, and the hills themselves bore no green, stripped bare and stained with ash. To draw breath in a company town was to inhale the mine itself, to carry it inside your body, whether you wanted to or not. The air was not yours, it was theirs. Bread and breath, two things as simple and as essential as life could offer, were bent into tools of power. The company needed no chains when it could take hold of a man's hunger. no whips when it could tighten its grasp on the very air he breathed. Each bite, each gasp was part of the bargain, a reminder that survival came only on the company's terms. Men knew it, even if they did not always speak of it. At the table, wives divided portions carefully, cutting bread into thin slices, pouring beans with steady hands, making sure every child received something before touching their own plate. In the mornings, the same wives handed their husbands tin pails with bread, a scrap of meat if fortune allowed, perhaps a slice of pie saved for endurance. The men carried those pails into the shaft like lifelines, knowing that hunger underground could dull a mind, slow a hand, invite disaster. Children felt it most keenly, for their bodies grew faster than the bread could stretch. They learned early not to ask for more, to chew slowly and swallow quietly. Hunger followed them to school, if school was available, or into the fields and the mine itself, where boys became breakers, crouched for hours picking slate from coal until their fingers bled. The company fed them just enough to keep them working, and nothing more. Bread was a reward for obedience, withheld when discipline was required. And then there were the promises. Always the promises. The company would build a new bakery, lower the prices, bring in better flour, provide fresh milk for children, improve ventilation in the shafts. Each promise sounded generous when spoken aloud, and for a moment, hope flickered like a candle in the dark. But the bakery baked little. The flour remained expensive. The milk turned sour before it reached the shelves. The fans broke and were not repaired. Promises became another form of hunger, feeding expectation while leaving the stomach empty. In church, the preacher sometimes spoke of bread as the body, of air as the spirit, of divine gifts given freely. Yet in the pews, the congregation sat with stomachs hollow and lungs aching, knowing that bread cost scrip and air came with dust. The hymns rose, thin and breathless, carrying both faith and doubt in equal measure. God might provide, but the company always collected first. There were moments of rebellion, small and desperate. A man might sneak off to another town to buy flour at a fair price, carrying it back under the cover of night. A woman might barter with a neighbor, trading soap she had made for a sack of beans. Children sometimes stole, slipping a potato into a pocket when the store clerk's back was turned. Each act was dangerous, each act a risk of eviction, yet hunger drove them forward. Still, no rebellion could unbind the chain completely. The company always found ways to reassert its grip. Debts were called in, wages docked, houses repossessed. The message was clear: your bread is ours, your breath is ours, and your life is measured only in coal. This grip was not always visible, but it was always present. You could see it in the stooped shoulders of men at the end of a shift, in the hollow cheeks of children, in the way women held their aprons tightly closed against the soot that fell from the sky. You could hear it in the coughing that filled the night, in the silence when families counted their coins, in the prayers whispered over empty plates. The mine consumed more than coal. It consumed hunger, turning it into obedience. It consumed breath, turning it into profit. And as long as the company controlled both, survival itself remained a form of surrender. For those who lived in the company town, bread was never only bread, and breath was never only air. They were the boundaries of existence, drawn not by God or nature, but by men who valued profit above life. To eat was to concede, to breathe was to obey, and so long as the mine remained, the company's grip on bread and breath would never loosen, not for a day, not for a generation. Childhood in the company town was measured not by toys or games, but by work, hunger, and shadows. From the first cries of infancy, the air they breathed carried coal dust, and from their earliest steps, the ground beneath their feet trembled with the rumble of carts and trains carrying the black rock away. These were not children in the way the word might conjure, bright faces chasing sunlight across open fields. These were children molded by soot, their days compressed into narrow routines, their futures carved into the same stone as their fathers' tombstones. The sun was rarely theirs, In the narrow valleys where the towns clung, mountains rose steep and close, their peaks blocking much of the day's light. Smoke from the mine and the company's furnaces thickened the sky into a permanent dusk, so that even when the sun was present, it was veiled. Children played, if they played at all, under this dim canopy, their eyes accustomed to twilight more than to daylight. Some grew so used to the gloom that when they travelled beyond the valley, on rare occasions, perhaps to visit relatives or in search of food, they squinted painfully at the brightness, as though the natural world itself were too harsh to bear. But most never left. From the earliest years, they were folded into the routines of survival. A boy might begin carrying water to the mine entrance before he was 10, his thin arms struggling with the weight of the buckets. A girl might spend her childhood mending clothes worn thin by her father's shifts, or tending siblings while her mother laboured in endless cycles of cooking, washing, and stretching food that was never enough. Childhood was not a stage to pass through, but a burden to shoulder, and it pressed down early, hard, and without pause. For many boys, the breakers were their first prison. The breaker was a building set above the mine, where coal emerged sharp and jagged, laced with slate and stone. There, boys as young as 7 crouched for hours at wooden chutes, their fingers bleeding as they plucked impurities from the stream of coal. The dust filled their throats, stung their eyes, and embedded itself in every crease of skin. The noise was unrelenting. The crash of rock, the groan of machinery, the shouted orders of overseers. Sunlight might exist outside those walls, but inside, there was only the dim glow of lamps and the choking air. Accidents happened here too, just as they did underground. A hand caught in the gears, a body dragged by a conveyor, a fall from the rafters where boys sometimes climbed to escape an overseer's wrath. These accidents were rarely recorded, and when they were brushed aside as unfortunate necessities of progress. A child's life cost little in the company's eyes, and so the breakers devoured them as readily as the mine devoured men. Girls were spared the breakers, but not spared the weight of the town. Their work was quieter, less visible, but no less binding. They became second mothers before they reached adolescence, caring for younger siblings while their mothers struggled with endless domestic tasks. They learned to cook with almost nothing, to patch clothes until the fabric was more repair than original, to silence their own hunger so their brothers might eat. Their futures were bound as tightly as the boys'. Marriage to a miner, motherhood in a shack that leaned against the tracks, the same endless fight against scarcity. School existed in name, but rarely in practice. The company might fund a small building, a teacher or two, a place where children sat on hard benches with slates in their laps. Lessons were interrupted by the needs of survival. A boy might be pulled from class to carry supplies. A girl might be kept home to tend an infant. Attendance was a luxury few could afford. And even for those who did attend, the lessons offered little escape. The words of history and arithmetic floated in dusty rooms. But outside, the mine and the breakers pulled at them relentlessly. Education was never stronger than hunger, and hunger won every time. Some children never knew sunlight simply because their days were carved into darkness. Boys old enough, or desperate enough, were sent underground. There, they served as trappers, crouched in silence beside wooden doors, opening and closing them to control the airflow of the tunnels. Hours passed in near blackness, with only the dim flicker of a lamp and the occasional rumble of carts. They sat alone, small figures swallowed by the earth, their ears straining for sounds of approaching danger, their minds numbed by solitude. By the time they emerged, the sun had often set, leaving them no more light above ground than they had below. The body adapted to such rhythms, but the spirit did not. Children grew with bent spines, with chronic coughs, with eyes too used to dimness. They learned early that their lives belonged not to themselves, but to the company. Each coin of scrip their work earned returned quickly to the store. Each day's effort absorbed into the endless debts of their households. Childhood became an apprenticeship in submission, a preparation for the longer servitude that awaited them as adults. And yet, Within this grimness, there were flickers of something else, faint, fleeting, but real. A child might steal an hour of play, rolling a wheel down the tracks, carving toys from scraps of wood, chasing after the few birds that dared live in the soot-stained valley. Girls might sing as they worked, their voices weaving fragile threads of beauty into the air. Boys might whisper dreams of leaving, though few ever did. These small rebellions of joy did not erase the darkness, but they marked it with moments of light, however dim. The company tolerated such moments only so long as they did not interfere with labor. Children were resources, as surely as coal seams were, and to waste them was considered foolishness. Overseers spoke of discipline, of the need to toughen boys for the mine, of the virtue of obedience. They spoke less often of the toll it took, the bowed backs, the stunted growth, the shortened lives. Children who never saw the sun often did not live long enough to miss it. Families accepted this as inevitability, though acceptance did not mean lack of grief. Mothers buried children before they themselves reached middle age, their arms carrying small coffins to the churchyard, already crowded with graves. Fathers turned silent, their faces hardened, their words few. In these households, laughter was rare, and when it came, it carried the sound of defiance as much as joy. The town's children inherited not just work, but silence. They grew up watching their parents swallow anger, watching strikes collapse, watching promises break. They learned that speaking too loudly could cost you everything, and so they spoke quietly, cautiously, their words carrying more weight than their years. Whispers of rebellion lived among them too, but they were fragile, easily crushed beneath the boot of hunger. For those who survived into adulthood, the mine claimed them as predictably as the seasons turned. A boy who had once been a breaker became a miner, his lungs already scarred, his muscles already hardened. A girl who had stretched bread thin became a wife, her body already weary from labor long before childbirth added its toll. Childhood ended not with celebration, but with surrender, a quiet slide into the same routines that had swallowed their parents. And so, generation after generation, the company's grip extended through time as well as space. Bread and breath had been taken from the parents, and from the children, even sunlight itself. The town became a place where childhood was less a beginning than an inheritance of shadows, passed down like debt, binding the young before they had any chance to claim a future of their own. In such a place, even memory faltered. Children who never saw the sun grew into adults who barely remembered it, and their own children inherited the same dimness. The cycle of hunger, labor, and silence became the air itself, thick and unbroken, until the thought of another life seemed like fantasy. For them, the sun might as well have belonged to another world entirely, one they could only imagine but never touch. The valley that had once pulsed with the rhythm of carts and picks did not end with a roar, but with a slow sigh. What seemed eternal, the endless hunger of the mine, the company's grip on every loaf of bread and every breath, proved fragile against the passing of years. Coal seams thinned, profits shrank, and the empire that had bound men and children alike began to loosen. But for the people within those wooden houses, the change did not arrive as a blessing. It came as abandonment, a gradual fading of life until the town itself dissolved into dust. Houses built cheaply and quickly leaned further with every season. Paint peeled, wood rotted, and shingles slipped from their roofs. But no repairs came. Where once the company had maintained enough order to keep families tied to its orbit, now it withdrew its hand, leaving the town to crumble on its own. The store that had once dictated every purchase closed its doors. The windows boarded, the counters stripped bare. The scrip that had once trapped families lost even the illusion of value. The coins and slips of paper became scraps for children's games, tokens of a world that no longer wanted them. The silence was the first sign that the town was dying. Where the air had been filled with the clang of steel, the murmur of voices, and the groan of wagons, there was now only stillness. The mineshaft stood at the center like an abandoned altar, its mouth dark and unmoving. The whistle that had once called men to work no longer blew, and the absence of its cry felt heavier than the sound itself had ever been. Families sat on porches staring at the empty tracks, waiting for shipments that would never come, for orders that had long since shifted to newer, richer seams elsewhere. Without the company's wage, meager though it had been, hunger grew sharp. Families scavenged what they could. Gardens sprouted in hard, stony soil, small plots of corn and beans clinging to life along the edges of the valley. Men trapped rabbits. Women gathered greens from the woods. Children carried buckets to streams. Yet the land was thin and tired, unable to yield enough to feed so many. For those who had known only dependence on the company store, the shift to self-reliance came late, and often too late. Some families drifted away, walking or riding the rails to other towns where mines still rumbled. They carried little, for little could be carried. A trunk, a chair, a few quilts, perhaps a Bible. They left behind houses that sagged more with each passing winter, empty shells that stared out with hollow windows. Others could not leave, bound by debt, by illness, by sheer exhaustion. They remained as the streets grew quieter, as neighbors vanished, as familiar voices no longer called across the yards. Children who had once trudged to the breakers found themselves wandering aimlessly, their futures stripped from them before they had begun. Some played in the abandoned mine, their laughter echoing in spaces that had known only toil. Others grew restless and angry, stealing food or hopping trains in search of something, anything that might offer escape. The older ones, hardened too young by labor, drifted into nearby towns as day laborers, carrying with them lungs already scarred, eyes already dulled. The church bell rang less often, its rope frayed and unused. Weddings became rare, funerals frequent, graves multiplied along the hillside, marked by wooden crosses that weathered quickly in the rain. With each burial, the town seemed smaller, the ties weaker, the will to endure thinner. It was not catastrophe that undid the town, but the slow attrition of neglect, the quiet erasure of people from a place no longer deemed profitable. Nature moved in where industry retreated. Weeds split the tracks. Vines climbed the walls of the store. Grass pushed through cracks in the road. Birds returned to rafters once blackened by soot. The air grew clearer, but it carried with it an emptiness, as though the valley itself had forgotten the weight of human presence. The silence deepened, not peaceful but hollow, as if the land had swallowed the memory of what had been demanded of it. Those who remained carried on in smaller, quieter rhythms. Women scrubbed clothes in the streams, hung them on lines strung between leaning houses. Men repaired tools in hopes of finding work beyond the valley. The evenings, once marked by the weary return of miners, became long stretches of waiting, punctuated only by the crackle of fires and the sound of wind slipping between broken boards. Stories began to slip away too. The memory of accidents, of strikes, of whispered promises lost their edges as those who had lived them passed on. Children who had grown without sunlight grew now without history. Their minds turned toward leaving rather than remembering. The company that had once been everything, the provider of bread, the owner of breath, was spoken of less and less, as though silence could erase the bitterness of its rule. In time, even those who had vowed never to leave found themselves drawn away. A son found work in a distant city, and parents followed. A daughter married into another town. Families that had endured for generations packed what little they owned and disappeared into the wider world. The valley, once crowded with voices, became a scatter of empty homes, each one leaning toward collapse. Rain leaked through roofs, snow piled in corners where windows had broken, doors swung open in storms. The mine shaft, once guarded and patrolled, stood exposed. Some said it breathed, exhaling faint draughts of cold air that carried the scent of dust and iron. Others avoided it, fearing collapse, or simply unwilling to step closer to the mouth that had swallowed so many. Travelers passing through sometimes stumbled upon the place, They spoke of it as ghostly, a town without movement, where even the air seemed to wait for footsteps that never came. They saw children's shoes scattered on porches, pots rusting in kitchens, calendars still hanging on walls years after the days they marked had passed. It seemed less like a town that had ended, and more like one that had been quietly abandoned mid-breath, left to decay in its own time. Eventually, maps stopped naming it. Roads that once led to the mine fell into disrepair, washed out by rains, swallowed by woods. Newer generations did not speak of it at all, for there was nothing to say. The company had moved on, its ledgers closed, its profits drawn from other seams. The people had dispersed, their lives folded into other towns, other histories. What remained was dust, on the beams of houses, on the stones of the churchyard, on the rusting rails that led nowhere. And yet, for all its vanishing, the town was not entirely gone. In the lungs of those who had lived there, coal dust remained, carried into distant cities, where former miners coughed through their later years. In the hands of women who had stretched bread until it vanished, the habit of scarcity endured, shaping meals long after hunger had passed. In the eyes of children who had grown without sunlight, there lingered a certain squint, a certain suspicion of brightness. The town's shadow stretched far beyond its valley, carried in bodies, in memories, in silences that could not be named. Time moved forward, but the town did not. It remained in place, deteriorating, until collapse claimed its structures one by one. Roofs caved in, walls tumbled, weeds swallowed doorways. Eventually, little remained but scattered foundations and the outlines of streets, visible only to those who looked closely. Even the grave markers gave way to rot, the names they bore dissolving into the earth. What had once been everything, home, prison, life itself, became nothing more than a faint impression on the land, a scar fading beneath grass and trees. Those who had suffered there, who had endured hunger and accidents, who had raised children in the shadows of the breakers, were forgotten not through malice, but through the simple indifference of time. And so the town vanished, not with fire or flood, not with a single catastrophe, but with the slow erosion of need. Its story dissolved into silence, its people scattered, its dust carried by wind across hills that remembered nothing of their pain. To step there now would be to walk in a place emptied of voices, where only the faintest traces linger, shards of pottery, rusted nails, the suggestion of a road. The mine, too, collapsed at last. Its timbers gave way, its tunnels filled with water, its mouth choked with stone. The ground above sank, leaving hollows and scars where houses had once stood. What had consumed so many lives now consumed itself, folding back into the earth from which it had been torn. And in that silence, the lesson of the town remained, though unspoken. A place that had been built to extract, to consume, to hold people as tightly as it held coal, had proven as fragile as the lives it devoured. It was not eternal. It was not indestructible. It was dust, carried on the same wind that once howled through the valley, now scattering what was left of a town that had once believed it would never die. And so, friends, the tale drifts to its quiet end. A company town built on coal, and then unbuilt by it, leaving little more than dust in the wind and memories too heavy to carry. We've walked through streets where children coughed before they could speak, through homes where bread and breath were rationed by the company itself, through tunnels where men traded daylight for darkness, and through whispers of strikes, promises, and broken lives. We've seen how even the smallest moment of joy, a loaf of bread on a Sunday table, the sight of a hilltop at dusk, was wrapped in the shadow of coal dust. And we've seen how fragile those towns really were. A mine could close, a seam could dry, and in a season, the place that had consumed generations could vanish, leaving only broken timbers, empty houses, and a silence that settled heavier than the dust ever had. It makes you wonder, what would have become of us had we been born into such a place? Could we have breathed that air day after day? Could we have lived in houses that never felt clean, knowing each cough might be the first sign of lungs already failing? Could we have worked beneath the earth, with the roof above us groaning, unsure if we would see the sun again. That's the question tonight's story leaves us with. Not just how history was lived, but whether we ourselves could have endured it. Perhaps the real answer is hidden in the dust itself. No one truly survived a company town. They endured, they carried on, but the cost was written in their bodies, their families, and the very soil beneath their feet. Before we part ways tonight, I want to hear from you. In the comments, tell me, what moment from this story struck you most? Was it the children who never saw the sun, the families bound by the company store, or the towns that disappeared as if they had never existed? Your reflections are part of this journey too, tiny echoes across time. And if you've made it this far into the story, I hope you'll take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and join me again for the next long walk through the forgotten corners of history. Each time you do, it helps these old voices be heard just a little further, like coal trains rumbling out of the valley into the wider world. So until next time, rest easy, let the dust settle, let the hills grow quiet, and may sleep come gently, because here, in the stories of the past, the night never truly ends.